Hey everybody, executive producer and host, Pete Turner from the Break It Down Show. Hey, I wanted to do today's introduction once again, by the way, in an airport terminal, this time in Orlando, Florida. I was doing some client visits and working on some show stuff, and as you know, the Bulletproof podcast rig never fails me. That is an H6 from Zoom and SM35 microphones from Shure. If you want to do a podcast, that has got my professional endorsement. This stuff is awesome. You're not going to notice the crowd, probably won't notice the background music, but if you do, it's quite pleasant. So today's guest is fascinating. First off, we recorded this episode while he's in Malaysia. Normally he lives in Yemen, where that's a war-torn country right now, going through a sort of a civil/proxy war. His name is Tim Mackintosh-Smith, and he wrote a book about 2.5 inches thick called Arabs, a 3,000-year history of that people. And so you learn about Arabs, the history of Islam, and the Arabic language. It is a fascinating read. If you're into that part of the world, the Orient, Arabs, Islam, history in general, it is an absolutely invaluable book. If you work professionally in that part of the world, it's compulsory. You have to read this book, and it's just fantastic. Tim's done this is one of those books that 100 years from now, people will still be referencing it because it's just, I just can't say enough stuff. If 5 stars is the top, I'll give it 17 stars. It's a really great book. So if you're interested in those kind of things, definitely buy it. It is worth a read, especially because there's a lot of charts and helpful things as you get through the names and the times. It's very good. So on Kindle, it's excellent. Either way, I'm joined today by Colonel John McKay, who also reviewed the book and is an international man of excellence himself, retired Marine Colonel, and you all probably remember him from several episodes here on the Break It Down Show. So the three of us get together and have a long conversation about the book, Arabs, and Islam in general. Hey, so support the show. Here's how you support me. And I know a lot of you are already doing this. Thank you for that. Sharing the show is the absolute best way to do it. You can buy shirts on the website. You can, tell your friends. Just in general, getting the word out about the show, commenting when we post it, that all helps. Keep doing that. Keep telling people about it. I'll keep making great shows. There are some fantastic episodes coming up I'm super stoked about. And maybe, just maybe, I've gotten lucky and grabbed another really, really huge guest. We'll see how that goes. Hey, as always, I'm going to ask you to support Save the Brave. Go to savethebrave.org. Drop a little bit of money in the coffer each month through PayPal. We're glad to do it. $5 would do. $20 would do. $50 would do. Whatever it is that you can afford, then you can say, without a doubt, I support veterans. I put my money where my mouth is, just like John, Scott, and I all do. And I would appreciate it if you do. Let me know. And I'm glad to shout out your support. I'm glad to keep it anonymous if you'd like. But let me know if you're supporting so that so we can keep track and make sure we thank you personally. Either way, I thank all of you for listening to the show. If you're new to the show, get ready. We do this a lot. 5 shows a week, a lot of topics. Buckle up, hang on. And now, here comes Tim Mackintosh-Smith.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick
This
Morata.
is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hey, this is Robin Dreek, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
This is Tim Mackintosh-Smith, and we're listening to the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, we've got Tim Mackintosh-Smith, who's written an incredible book. It's the 3,000-year history of the Arabs, and it's a 2.5-inch tome, and it's just an incredible, outstanding book. And a while back, I was sitting across from Marine Colonel John McKay, who's co-hosting today, sitting across from him, and we were talking about your book, and he said, "Man, I would love to talk to Tim." And so we reached out, and Tim at the time lived in what is currently still war-torn Yemen, and over the months, we've managed to get our schedules aligned, and we have this chance to have this conversation. And I guess for all of you in the audience, you're about to have your mind blown. The 3,000-year history of Arabs. Tim has done. Is this going to be one of those books that 100 years from now, it'll be like one of those foundational books of knowledge about the Arab people? I mean, this is a really incredible thing, and we're so fortunate to have you, and of course, blessed to have John here as well, because John has a deep knowledge of this stuff and world events in general, and actually has written a review about the book. And I just I want to give John a chance to chat, but I want to preload the first question. And you know, the United States has just killed the #1 general in Iran. And everybody's all on Twitter and talking about things that they really don't have any idea about. You are uniquely able to talk specifically about what this might mean for Iran. Like from the American point of view, from mine, Iran continues to push and push and push. And this time they got their bluff called, and it cost them something. And now there's going to have to be a reshuffling of the deck to see what happens next. This is not the beginning of a big war. This is the continuation of this herky-jerky confrontation that the region, the Greater Orient has with Iran. I'm going to leave that question sitting and let John kind of open up and give his thoughts, and we'll get to it.
You know, with this having occurred on Friday, yesterday, it was actually one of the questions I wanted to pose to Tim, and I'm probably going to be at variance with you, Pete, because my question to Tim was, does this have the potential, the killing of the two generals, the Iraqi general, Qasem Soleimani, and the Iranian general, does this have the potential of being a game changer vis-a-vis regional tensions?
Look, first of all, I would say I'm not an Iran expert, and actually, it's kind of, Iran is a funny place. It's next to the Arab world, but it is so different in many ways. It's different culturally, it's different linguistically, and the two of those things are very much connected. Okay, there's a shared faith in Islam, but Iran is kind of a bit of a closed book to many of us who live in the Arab world. And this recent happening, well, I was completely shocked by it. I wasn't entirely surprised. It seems to be like a kind of early 21st century equivalent of gunboat. I won't say gunboat diplomacy. There was nothing diplomatic about it. It was certainly, I would say, a very rash act. Whether it's a game changer, I don't know. If you ask me in a week, I might be able to give you a better question. I hope and pray that the region isn't heading for all-out confrontation. Maybe things will just bubble along as they are, but on a much higher level of escalation.
Thank you. You hear shrill voices that this actually constitutes an act of war. And the turnaround question I would ask is, not necessarily of you, Tim, but what would we, the United States, have done if Iran, somebody in Iraq, whoever, had killed General Petraeus or killed Jim Mattis? What would the reaction of the United States have been?
Well, that is exactly the question that you have to ask yourself always in such cases. And all right, is it enough to say the guy was planning attacks on the United States? I mean, it wouldn't stand up in a court of law.
Of course not.
Of course not. And I don't think there's any doubt about the rashness and illegality in international law of what's happened.
Exactly.
But I would say actually the drones are the present day equivalent of gunboats, looking back to the British Empire. And the Brits were accused of a certain rashness, gung-ho-ness in their actions. And I think probably the Trump presidency will be seen by history in the same light.
Well, the United States was a quick learner because we certainly flexed our quote unquote diplomatic muscle through that type of thing in Central America in the 30s, China in the early part of the 1900s. We were quick to pick that sort of thing up, and we could go on philosophically for how much damage that probably is done.
Yes. The difference today to me seems that, you know, assassinations are hardly unknown in history, and assassinations of this nature, but actually to proclaim that you have done it and so quickly is really, it seems new to me. As I say, I'm not an expert on Iranian history, but going back to the 50s, there was the case of Sadek, but I don't think there was any claim to whoever was behind the assassination made in such a way as this. You know, the very same day,
right?
President Trump says, "Oh, you know, I ordered it." So this does seem to be quite upfront, to put it mildly.
Yeah,
he manages to do that, intended or otherwise.
Yeah. Okay, let's get in a little bit into the book, because it goes, I mean, first off, it goes way, way back, and you talk about a variety of things, you know, becoming Arabs and how the language evolves, and how only relatively recently it became a written language. What on earth possessed you to write a multi-thousand-page tome that's so complex? And I mean, how long did this thing take to do it? And then why did you do this?
Well, I did it much against my better judgment, because I knew it would take a hell of a long time. And I knew it would be damned hard work, and it was. But mainly I did it because somebody asked me to do it. You would never willingly put yourself through writing a 3,000-year history. I mean, it really is. It's hard work. It's endless work. Yale University Press, the publishers, suggested it first, I think, back in about 2008, and it came out in 2019. So really, it took 11 years. Now, not all of that was writing. The first few years were saying, no way will I do this. Much too hard work. You know, why? Not enough money, and so on. But in the end, when you get into something like this, you look at all your notes from the reading from past years, decades, and you kind of put it all together, and then you just kind of beaver away. You put your head down. Really, in the planning, it took 5 or 6 years. In the actual writing, it took 3 or 4 years, and then there's all the editing process. So it takes a long time. Philip Hitty's Arab History, which came out about 1933, I think, which was a great book, and still is very, very useful. I think he took something like 10 years. Albert Hourani, his big Arab history came out about 30 years ago. Also, it took a similar time. You can't really deal with such a long time scale in just a year or two. It takes years and years.
Oh, wow. Well, in my humble opinion, you've done an outstanding job.
One thing I've tried to do, and talking about timescales, by the way, is that a lot of people who've written about Arabs in the past, they start their books by saying, in 622 AD, the Arabs burst onto the international scene with the advent of Islam and the hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad. When he traveled from Mecca to Medina. And all right, that is a possible starting point. But I've done quite a lot more. And I looked at, I said, that was about 1,400 years ago. Right. But in fact, we have written references to Arabs going back 1,400 years before Islam. So I've tried to cover that first forgotten half of Arab history that a lot of people neglect. And it's so important for understanding the second half.
Yeah, you talked quite a bit about the early, you know, the Arabian Peninsula, the Southern Arabs, and all of the evolution of these different people. I especially loved when they figured out a camel and a horse made for a fantastic, you know, mini war unit, because you could provision yourself and move quickly. Where do these texts come from that allow you to pull these bits of brilliance. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, not as much as you, but that's the first time I'd heard about that. I knew they raided, but I didn't understand the tactics of it.
Yeah, well, if you look back at the old texts, they always talk about camels and horses going together into battle, and exactly as you say, you kind of load your belongings onto your camel and your food supplies and your heavier weapons and armor and everything else, and you kind of plod along, and then you have your light-footed horse trotting away beside you. And then when you actually go into battle, you couch your camel and it sits down, and you jump onto your horse and you whiz into battle with your lance. So you have kind of, you are your own baggage train, effectively. And this is what made Arab armies so effective and so brilliant in the early period, this combination of those two creatures, the camel and the horse. You know, I think I said somewhere in the book that if you try to fight wars using only horses or only Arab horses, which are very light and fast, it would be like trying to fight a battle today using a Lamborghini sports car.
Right.
So, you know, you need that transport as well, heavy transport, which is provided by the camel.
Tim, again, I'm just quoting a small part of your book, but I got a question I think that would interest the audience. In the section of your book called Dominance, under Cascades, which is an interesting word, chapter 7, you write of the Battle of Siffin, which took place in 657 AD, I believe. And of course, other battles are mentioned throughout your book. But I came away with your description of the Battle of Siffin, and the words you used, which I thought were excellent, brilliant, with a distinct impression that this was a battle all but unknown in the West, really. I mean, I've got a couple of encyclopedias of military history, and I think the most extensive is about 3 paragraphs. But I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you provided the pretext for the division of Islam into 2 major sects, the Shia, or supporters of Ali, and the more orthodox Sunnah, who had abhorred Ali. Am I accurate in my interpretation?
Yeah, I don't think it was a question of orthodoxy and heterodoxy at the time, or you know, abhorrence or anything like that. Again, I would say it was to do with that motor of history, which is the search for power. And I think you have to bring it down to quite a simple level and just say that, yeah, the 2 main actors, or the two opponents in the battle, were Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad and also his son-in-law, on one side, and Muawiyah on the other side. Now, Muawiyah was the son of somebody called Abu Sufyan, and he had been the most powerful man in old pagan Mecca.
Okay.
That family, Muawiyah's family, were the big shots. In fact, they were also cousins of Muhammad's branch of the same family. But Muawiyah's branch had the money, they had the power, and in a sense, Muawiyah thought, oh, you know, why should I give this up? He was trying to continue clinging to that power that his immediate clan had before Islam. Ali represented this new power, which had coalesced around the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
So it was really this search for power that caused that conflict and that battle. A terrible, terrible battle, and quite a reliable figure, though as Arabic texts always say, God only knows the truth.
Right.
But quite a reliable figure for dead, the dead in it was 70,000. 70,000 dead in an inter-Arab, inter-Muslim fight very early on. And the descriptions, I remember I quoted something about, the dust raised by the battle covering the sun, and nobody knew if it was night or day. Nobody knew if it was the time to pray. So, religion was sort of blotted out by this horrible earthly search for power. And there was it on and on it went with nobody really winning. Perhaps Ali actually winning slightly getting the upper hand. And then Muawiyah's side said, look, we've got this holy book, the Quran. And on his side, they tied copies of the Quran or probably leaves of the Quran to their lances. And they said, let the book of God decide. Let God decide in this. And that, in a sense, it crystallizes quite a lot of what happens after, because on one side you have the book, the text, and on the other side you have the man, Ali, who is a close relative of the Prophet. So it is a bit of a conflict between the authority of the word and the authority of a person. And this comes out in time as what we think of as the Sunnah and Shia divide. But really, to begin with, it was to do with power. And I believe that most history, probably all history, is to do with power.
Yeah.
Power, money, sex, all that kind of thing.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm shocked.
This is mine. I want to keep it, or no, I want to take it from you. That is the motive force of history.
Yes, absolutely.
If we're all nice to each other, then there isn't much history happening. Thank God. Who was it? Fukuyama saying, "Oh, history, announcing the end of history." And I think if we were all good friends, perhaps history would end.
Tim, how did the empires deal with the Arabs in general? What kind of texts are out there? I mean, I don't know if they go all the way back to Sumerian times, but Babylonians, Egyptians, Romans, how did they deal with the early Arab sects? Or were the Arabs just so far out in the hinterlands that they weren't really a problem?
Well, obviously they were far out, and that's probably one. That's a possible basic meaning of Arab. The people who sort of dwell in the boondocks, in the sticks. But in fact, even though they were physically, geographically a long way away, they were often very important because Northern Arabia, think of it, Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula kind of slots in like a wedge, like a keystone into Eurasia, okay? Or think of Africa plus Eurasia, this huge landmass. And there's all this coming and going, east-west, mostly east-west. And this conflict between empires. A couple of thousand years ago, we're talking about Romans and Persians, and here is Arabia slotted into this very important junction, where three great land masses are coming together: Africa, Asia, and a bit to the north, Europe. Okay, so even though the Arabs were kind of on a limb in the Arabian Peninsula, they could be very useful to empire builders and empire defenders as a kind of defensive force. And leaping ahead to the British Empire, the Brits in South Arabia, they had something called the Hadrami Bedouin Legion. John Bagot Glob, the commander in Transjordan, he had a sort of Bedouin Legion. He had these guys on camels who who were very mobile and good fighters. And this is how Arabs tended to get used by neighboring empires. So, in fact, the very first mention of Arabs that we have, it's 853 BC. I think it's 853. Certainly 9th century BC. It's an Arab owner of camels who seems to have hired or lent 1,000 camels to the dispute between the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So really Arabs come into history with that as kind of middlemen, providers of transport, mercenaries. That's their kind of role. And they continue to play that part up until when the Roman and the Persian empires begin falling apart and very, very weak in the early 7th century. And then they see their chance and they leap into world history as empire builders themselves.
Just a quick observation in your book and in your, shall I say, adopted country was referred to and is referred to in Roman chronicles as the Arabia Felix, happy Arabia.
Yes,
and it was important to the Roman Empire. The number of people that have any feeling for that, and to put together the Queen of Sheba with Yemen, even among your more fervent evangelicals, I'm not sure they can put the square peg in the square hole all the time with that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what your question is exactly here.
My question
John.
it was an observation more than anything else, that as far as the Roman Empire and the
right.
Arab region coming to the fore, the Romans certainly exploited it from what you.
Oh yes, yeah, you're absolutely right, and obviously there was more interaction with Arabs or speakers of Arabic-like languages in the north of the peninsula, like the Nabateans,
right?
The people in Petra, in today's
right.
Jordan, people in Palmyra in today's Syria, who were kind of traders and middlemen, and the Romans had a lot to do with them. But also, you're absolutely right. They had dealings with Arabia Felix, Yemen, right down in the south of the peninsula. And the Romans even sent an expedition not many decades BC under somebody called Aelius Gallus, who was the commander in Egypt. And that went down deep into Yemen. In fact, it failed and they had to turn around and go back. If I may say, one of many failed interventions in what we now call the Middle East from outside. But there was a lot of interaction, much more than we think.
Little prescient, I would say.
Yes. People say history repeats itself. History doesn't. Again, history like religion is innocent, but people repeat themselves.
That's right.
The history repeating itself thing, and we're kind of jumping around, but this just strikes me as a curious question. In Judeo-Christian history, specifically Christian, you have this Reformation that happens. There's a schism, and then we all kind of think, granted, it's tremendously bloody, and everybody's sort of fractured, but Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Baptists, we all kind of can get along together. Yeah. Two things. One, if Muhammad had a will, and a right of, who's going to take over next, and it was more clear than just, hey, go do this for a while, might the schism have been avoided, or is this just always going to happen? And then two, are we still waiting for this bonding between Shia, and I'm leaving out a lot of groups, but Shia and Sunni? Is there going to be some kind of healing like we sort of have in the Christian world?
Oh, golly, yes. Well, to talk about Muhammad to begin with, it's a whole vexed question about what his intentions were.
Right.
to do with whoever was going to succeed him. And both sides have their own views.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
And both sides have their own views. And I mean, in my mind, the weight of history seems to be in favor of what actually happened, which was that Abu Bakr, who led the prayers during the Prophet's final illness and then took over and was agreed to be the new leader. But did the Prophet, in fact, want Ali, his son-in-law and cousin, to take over? I don't think you can say, I don't think you can come down on either side absolutely 100% definitely. We can't get into the mind of somebody who died that long ago on his deathbed. So there will always be arguments about that. In terms of whether different sects can come together, I think if religion can, if Islam can assert its independence from politics and say, actually, it is a religion, it's above all these earthly wranglings about power, then people can get together, certainly. No problem at all. But at the moment, religion and power politics are so entangled,
Right.
there's not much prospect of reconciliation in the near future. I mean, I hope and I pray from the bottom of my heart that it will happen, that it'll happen sooner rather than later. But I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question, and this you do address it in the book, but how do you see the evolving status of women in the Arab world? We're not talking about Persia here, but in the Arab world today, how do you view that?
Yeah, I think today it's so different from, you know, we talk about the Arab world, we talk about the Arabs, and I make a point in my big book that we should really talk about Arabs. They're not kind of one homogenized mass or lump. So, you know, the position of women in Yemen is different from their position in next door Saudi Arabia. It's different again in Lebanon. It's, you know, it's so different from one country to another that you can't talk about an attitude to women or a position of women. I think looking over history, at the beginning of in South Arabian history, pre-Islamic history, women had a very strong position. We have, of course, the story you mentioned, the Queen of Sheba, and you know, there are debates about who exactly she was, but women obviously did have a very high position. The Quran admits this and talks about the Queen of Sheba and how she ruled by shura, which means by consultative assembly. So the idea of women having power and there being a certain amount of democracy, even long before Islam, was known by early Muslims. Early Muslim women could have great power. And somebody like Aisha, the Prophet's wife, one of his wives, you know, the young woman who, in a sense, you know, she had great power after his death, and was involved in politicking and even in fighting. There's a battle called the Battle of the Camel, in which she was directing her partisans from a litter on top of a camel. So, you know, to think of women in the past as kind of shrinking violets, or wallflowers or whatever, it doesn't really work. I think a lot of actually Byzantine and Persian attitudes to women were imposed or placed themselves on top of Arab opinions. So, you know, ideas about veiling and that sort of thing, as often as not, come from outside Arab culture. Yeah, I think we've always got to be careful about not talking about the position of women in the Arab world, because it's so different from one place to another.
I have to fully agree with you, and I wasn't trying to set you up at all. My experience is limited, though it has been predominantly with the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And I was very fortunate, particularly not speaking the language, to be invited into several Palestinians' homes as the only American. And when I went back over in 2008, even my wife and I were invited into Palestinian homes. My observation there was that one gentleman who will remain nameless, very, very prominent and in his particular field is known worldwide, and he's been successful. We would go to his, or before when I was first over there, I'd go to his house, and you know he deals in very high sums of money, and the house was not lavish but very nice. And the minute he walked in the door, he was no longer in charge.
Yes.
and then
you've got it.
Yeah, and again, he'll remain nameless, the colonel that was in charge of security in Gaza. And I had a wonderful Bedouin translator, Khalil, and we went everywhere together, and I was not burdened with other Americans. But this colonel would often have us in the house, and I was explaining to Pete, you know, you walked in, you could hear the women in the kitchen. But you didn't see them, and you know the first thing that came out was a bottle of scotch, and you know after the meal they'd hook up the hookah, and you would get a glimpse of the women, but I just the nuances, not speaking the language, was a terrible liability. The women. The women said when dinner was going to start or when the meal was going to start. And, you know, the colonel would get up and said, we go to the table now. And that's what prompted the question. Now, the Palestinians, per your just concluded explanation, are really a group apart. I think they're probably one of the more secular groups of people in the Muslim world. That's my opinion. I may be wrong. It's also a population I have a tremendous amount of empathy for.
And of course, don't forget that there are plenty of Palestinians who are Christian as well.
Oh, very much so. In fact,
but going back to
go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
But going back to women and experiences of you know, unexpected experiences with women in the Arab world. I always remember being stuck somewhere in Oman, in southern Oman, in a very kind of desert region. And for some reason, I'd been dropped off a pickup truck in the middle of nowhere, this great gravel plain, and the sun was beating down. There was nowhere to take shelter. And I waited and thought, am I just going to shrivel up and die here? And this another pickup comes out of the distance, and I leap onto the road. Stop! Save me! Put my head through the window, and it's a woman driving it.
Wow!
With a face mask, a kind of like a patent leather batwing face mask, like they wear down there. And I kind of went, "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were a lady, and just drive off and leave me to die." And she said, "What's this nonsense you're talking? Jump in the back." And I jumped in the back. And we went on, and we picked up all these other odds and sods, an Indian here, Pakistani there, Bangladeshi there. And she ended up with this pickup load of kind of lost travelers. And, one by one, we got out, and I got out, and she said, "This is our custom. It doesn't matter that I'm a woman. I wouldn't leave anyone in the desert stuck like that." So, you might see her wearing her batwing face mask and think, "Oh, don't speak to her, keep your distance." But in fact, there she is doing what any guy would do.
There is that perception, I guess, or misperception about the Arab world in general. And I guess when I think about, the raiding nation, or style of Arabs, it is sort of weird that they pushed against alcohol, because you think of warriors, you think of people that live fast and hard, and they drink a lot, and without exception, everywhere I've been in the Arab world, I've been offered some kind of intoxicant, whether it was marijuana or hashish or opium, whiskey, beer, all of those things. I've had an Iraqi guy look over his shoulder and say, "This is how I do Ramadan," and pull a bottle of Johnny Black out of his desk during Ramadan,
Yeah, that is actually slightly shocking. But then, you have very good authority for such things. You have the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun. He writes in a line of poetry. It goes, as far as I remember, drink and enjoy it, but just be aware that you're not supposed to be doing it.
Right.
So it's the guilt is not a bad thing.
Yeah, but our perception is, especially like with the military, was don't even drink water in front of these people. And so I would ask these questions, and use my cultural skills and say, I want to understand, like, is it offensive if I have a drink? And they're like, "You're not Islamic. You know that, right?" It's totally fine. If you want to eat with your left hand, we know that you're from California. We don't expect you to eat the way we eat. We love that you're eating with us. That's what matters. But we get bound up by all these perceptions without even asking. They're just a common question. Like, I'm curious about how you guys do this.
Yeah. I felt right from the beginning of my long experience in Arab lands that I had somehow landed with kind of an extended family, that somehow I belonged there, and that anything I did that was slightly different would somehow be accepted in the same way that, you might have 3 different children, they do things differently, but you accept each one for who he or she is. And this kind of acceptance, that's my experience of living in Arab lands, and particularly in Yemen. And it's something which will be with me until the day I die. And it's something that I miss every minute that I'm not in an Arab country. They're sort of, Arab lands are so physically exotic and different, and they look strange and so on. But in fact, you feel at home in them.
Interesting.
If I go back to one of the themes in your book, which I happen to agree with totally, and I tried to get that across in the review, is the criticality, and I use the word intentionally, of language. I think I mentioned one of our email exchanges. I've done a couple of articles on, how Americans use absolutely horrible about their whole philosophy about learning a foreign language. It's to our detriment, I feel. Do you feel that language will continue to be a key element within the Arab world?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure. What has kept the Arab world together, I would say more than religion, but over these millennia, it is language.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that there is a unified form of the language, call it classical language, call it standard Arabic, whatever you like, but there's one unified form of the language which I can write in, and somebody living in Mecca in the time of the Prophet would have been able to read what I write and understand it, and vice versa.
Right.
So it has this incredible stability. Obviously, it gets new words, new items of vocabulary, but as a language, it's incredibly stable. If you think of English, go back to the 7th century,
right.
Anglo-Saxons in Mercia or somewhere in England, we wouldn't understand. Arabic has this stability and this longevity. It's a very strong glue of the culture. But there are, of course, Arabic dialects, and nobody actually speaks that standard Arabic. So, I have worries, and a lot of people, a lot of Arab educators have worries about whether things like social media, people will use dialect more and more and more when they're writing, and whether the standard Arabic will gradually be lost.
Yeah.
Which will have repercussions on cultural unity.
Absolutely.
The language is an old language in terms of its ability to modernize within its own etymology. So words that I know for sure in Arabic are taxi, pizza, granted it's pizza, but a carburetor, computer. Those words are all, what do you call those? They're just taken straight out of the English language, because Arabic doesn't seem to tolerate new languages, or new words, I should say.
Not officially. I mean, there are these bodies rather like French have this body of sort of linguistic purifiers who try to chuck out anything which isn't kind of pure French, and you do have bodies like that in the Arab world.
Right.
But in fact, no, Arabic will bring in new items of vocabulary quite easily. And some of the efforts of the purifiers are doomed to failure. I mean, take the word sandwich, which sandwich in most people's Arabic. I don't know if this is actually true, but it's said that it was suggested that the correct Arabic for sandwich should be shatrun wa mashturun wa bainahuma tazij, which literally translated back means the half of something divided in half, and the other half of something divided in half, and between them something fresh. Work that out. It's easier to say sandwich, so there are practical considerations, and Arabic does things like telephone. Okay, telephone. You can call a telephone in Arabic telephone, but really it should be a hatif. And the hatif, if you go back in time, it was to the time when people kind of sacrificed animals and examined their entrails and that kind of thing, and voices came squeaking out of the desert, telling you about the future. The hatif was this kind of disembodied voice that accompanied the taking of auguries. So a hatif, a disembodied voice, has become the word for a telephone, and I love things like that because it's a cultural appropriation which is very appropriate.
Absolutely, and that one of the papers I wrote, one of my points was it's not a question of going to military language school and getting a 3. It's a question of culturating yourself, as I like to say, and I'll be risque and probably invite the wrath of those who disagree. One of the easiest ways to learn a dictionary, learn a language, is to find yourself a long-haired dictionary and proceed from there.
Yes.
Whatever your choice may be, but That's true. I mean, there's the business of intimacy, the business of, what do you call this? How do you it flows so much more naturally in an environment like that rather than in a classroom.
Yes, exactly. And if you look at the way children learn languages, I mean, that is the ideal way.
Yes. Yes.
Look at a small child; they'll get things wrong for several years, but eventually it comes right, and that's the natural way to pick it up.
Oh.
You live in Yemen. You have this deep understanding of the Arab history, obviously Islamic history, because they sort of go together, like Siamese twins, like you said. How was it for you day to day? I mean, this is a very dangerous place to live right now. What is the respect level for your scholarly work there? All of these things that you do to enculturate yourself and speak the language. How protected are you as someone who is of them but not with?
I think I'm probably a rather unusual person. I've lived in Yemen for so many years that I'm kind of just a kind of anomalous part of the furniture, and through all the darkest days with missiles coming in, the house literally shaking and the glass breaking and etc. and worrying for friends and loved ones and family, I always did feel protected, and I mean protected by my neighbors and friends, who I know wouldn't let me down. There have been some very dark times, of course. There's nothing worse than spending a whole night awake while the missiles come in. But in the end, you know that you have people who, in a sense, who love you, but the feeling is mutual.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I think John and I have both been in this situation where we've had to create those. We don't create it by design necessarily, but out of necessity because of the kind of work we've done. You need to do that.
Yeah, I mean, your position is obviously different. It's different from mine. How can you put it? If you go to a place and you fall in love with it, and then the place falls apart, there's nothing sadder.
Yeah.
But in effect, whatever happens to that place, you are still part of it, and you always will be. You are part of it, and it's part of you.
Yes, I've experienced the same again in my emails. I feel the same way about Latin America. I have no accent. I obviously could not pass for approving India in the Sierra, but my accent is such that probably none of them have ever seen a Cuban, but I obviously must be a Cuban, and that's fine.
Yeah. So, John, somebody should make a blockbuster movie about your life, a biopic, or at least write the biography.
I'm doing the memoirs, Tim.
Good.
It's been a labor of love, and I'm at an age when I try to keep my mind as active as possible. But I sort of promised the faculty, because I'm not teaching this semester, that I was going to try to finish it up by the end of the summer. I've got a lot done on it, but it needs a lot of work, as you rightfully know.
Yeah. Good. We'll never flag, never give up. Somebody said recently, I think, was it Philip Pullman? I believe it was Philip Pullman. He said that the only reason people don't write books is because they give up on them. So carry it through.
Yes, sir.
And you are a person who is obviously very rare and getting rarer. And what I'm worried about in the present climate, and I don't want to get into American politics, but it seems there is kind of a new move towards isolationism. Yeah. But you represent something much wider. You have a much wider background, and rejoice in this and publish it and show people, tell people about it.
Yeah, I definitely want to do that. And it's,
all the best to you in this labor of love, and I would love to be one of the first people to read it.
well, thank you very much. I have come to the conclusion, because I've been exposed to a very unique life, and I think I've also been, perchance, lucky, or maybe actually thought out things to do to increase my exposure, as it were, to the vagaries of the world, and it's been a wonderful experience. Now, you know, I rolled the dice a couple of times, almost came up with snake eyes, but hey, you know, it's
great. I love that. Yeah, the idea of the rolling the dice and vagaries. There's another great word, vicissitudes.
yes,
You know,
I'm familiar with it.
Not many people bandy that word around these days, vicissitudes. People like yourself have had plenty of vicissitudes. It makes you a much richer person. You know, money cannot buy vicissitudes. You have to go through the darn things. But then if you can write them down afterwards, you've done a service to mankind and literature.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And, you know, as in one of our early conversations, the last thing I want to do is memoirs of Colonel John McKay. And I took the K-bar between my teeth and charged the machine gun nest.
Yes.
Rather not go that route.
Hey, Tim, I have another question for you about the book. As you went through it, I'm sure your mind was blown any dozen number of times, but what stands out? What did that book teach you, either about yourself or about the Arabs? What's the one big thing?
Oh. There was one, it's actually a line of poetry, and it taught me this. I knew the line of poetry before, but it taught me the real meaning of it. And how can I explain it? If you write a history, particularly a big sort of overarching history like I've done, a doorstop, you are setting yourself up rather as a judge. And in the same way as a judge has to come down, occasionally on one side or another, that's part of the job. You do feel a responsibility. And sometimes it's an onerous, it's an awful responsibility. And sometimes I felt I was wearing the black cap. I don't know if it's the same in the US, but in Britain, when people were still executed, when the judge passed a sentence of death, he would put on a black cap. And sometimes when you write a history, you feel you are wearing the black cap, and it's an awesome and awful, terrible responsibility. And more, I had this line of poetry going through my mind, and it's actually by my grandfather, who was a poet, not at all known, but it's something that we used to have read to us when we were little. And it's the beginning of a poem, and it goes, "Judge not, or judge as kindly as you can. Only God discerns the heart of man. Judge not, or judge as kindly as you can. Only God discerns the heart of man." If you're a historian, you have to judge, and you have to judge kindly. And you have to be aware that there are things that you can never know. And if you believe in God, you will say God knows them. So it's kind of you have a sense of, I hate to say it, of power, because you're writing about what people have done in the past, and you're making decisions. Was this good? Was this bad? Was it right? Was it wrong? And I don't think in history you just say this happened, that happened, this happened, that happened. No, you have to make judgments in order to pull out the strands of history. But you have to be aware that you must cling to a humility, that you must never overreach yourself. And I
Yeah.
hope I've done this.
Well, I can tell you this. Everybody that I've talked to about the book who's read it or is desperate to read it are all glowing in their praise. And I don't know that many folks from the Arab world that have read it, but I think you've written an incredible book. So I don't think you have to wear too much of a black hat. You can sit back and go, man, I wrote that motherfucker, and be damn proud of it. It's a hell of a book, man.
Yeah, well, you kind of actually, in reality, you alternate between the black cap and the dunce's cap, because you also realize when you're writing a book like that how much you don't know at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a bit of a.
You know, the other thing that I want to sneak one more question in, then I'm going to let John ask whatever he wants. I worked in Salman Pak, and for those that are listening, Salman al-Farsi was the Prophet Muhammad's barber, and he was liked enough that he has his own shrine, and there's a couple other dudes buried there in the same shrine, so it's a multi-shrined out kind of place, and it is a quarter mile at best from the Ctesiphon Arch, which is this what should be a UNESCO heritage site, preserved and studied, because there's all kinds of tales and archaeological things around it. But that area was unique, Tim, because the mayor, if we allowed him to be the mayor, had a plan. And he's like, look, we can have Christian Kurds come down and run the casino and hotel because people will come here from all over the world. We'll have Sunnis running the shrine because it's their guy. And then the Shia. And then the Sunnis will run the arch and the education part because that's more, for what that's appropriate for what they do and their ability to work the university part of it. And I just thought it was this wonderful cultural magnet that we know so little about, not nearly enough about, but here is an Iraqi guy who's like, this is how you run this whole place and lock it all together and at least unify this pocket of southeastern Baghdad province. And I wanted to get your thoughts on something like that, like to take something as important historically for what the little we know about it and use it as a cultural icon to create stability.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You have to home in on these places, on these essential places. I'm thinking of a Yemeni equivalent, which is the dam at Marib.
Right.
And Marib it's off on the edge of the desert, but there was an ancient dam, this great hydraulic piece of engineering that goes back to, possibly more than 1000 BC. The present dam or the present remains that are there are a bit younger, but thousands of years old. And to look at something like that, to use it as a focus for all these warring parties, yeah, then you get a sense of the country. Because what is lacking so often these days is that sense of the country, the land, the way the land actually unites people and can unite people of very different backgrounds. And to have an extra focus, like, as you say, the Arch of Ctesiphon and Salman al-Farisi's shrine, it's something people can focus on, which is other than what makes them different. You need to find a narrative. You really need to dream a dream. And it was another Salman Rushdie, who wrote, I think, in his Midnight's Children, his great book that starts with the independence of India, and he's talking about India as a country, and he says, all these different people lived in India, but it was a dream that we all agreed to dream. And you have to have these focuses for dreams. You have to have dreams. Because once people start focusing on what makes them different, then things fall apart. And this is so sadly, what we're seeing at this present moment in history. I hope and pray that the moment is short. But eventually people will have to go back to dreaming these dreams and looking at great things like the Arch of Ctesiphon and the dam at Marib in Yemen and the great buildings in Egypt that can be focuses.
Tim, I'm going to change frequencies here just a little bit to get your permission. But I've been asked to abridge and consolidate the review I wrote for the Marine Memorial Club's monthly magazine down in San Francisco. I've agreed to do so, and I just wanted to say I do have permission from the publisher, American Conservative Magazine, mainly because they're not going to pay me anything. Trim it down, like I was talking to Pete, 2,100 words to 500 words. It's not worth the effort, so I'm going to rewrite it completely. But it's going to be condensed to 500 words. I think that's going to come out in the spring. It's basically a military club issue, but it's very well done, unless you have any objection.
Oh no, absolutely not. I'm very, very grateful for what you wrote and for your close reading, your eloquence in that longer review. And I know that anything you write about the book will thrill me. The nicest thing you can do for any writer is to write a good review of his book or her book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
It really makes my day. It makes my month.
And other things which I hate to mention, things that I can't deliver. I'm working with a couple of high-ranking general officers in the Marine Corps to get your book on the Marine officers reading list, which you're supposed to, as a Marine officer, as you move up through the grades, you're supposed to read a certain set of books. I've recommended this for Colonel and above. That appearing on the Commandant's reading list.
That's very good of you. I hope they don't curse me for having written something that's so long. You can always cheat and look at the when you read that book. There's a chronology at the back of it that I spent a long time writing, and you can if you want to pretend at a dinner party that you've read the whole thing, you can always whiz through that chronology. In fact, the plates, the pictures in the middle of it, captions under them, give a sort of condensation of the whole book. You could spend about 5 minutes reading those captions and at least have an idea of the whole thing.
Yeah,
of course, yes. I'm not advising people not to read my book, but if you want a quick overview, there is that chronology at the back. Plus, it's fun. I mean, there are lots of those bits of funny poetry and prose.
Oh, it's beautiful.
The book is really, I mean, obviously the knowledge is fantastic, but just it's very eloquent, man. And you've done a great job.
It is.
Yeah.
A very erudite author.
Yeah.
But he makes it fun to learn. He really does. The writing is so good.
Yeah, I'm also told that there are some terrible puns.
No. I've been around the British quite a bit, and your puns are not terrible. I have heard some British officers.
Yeah, they're mediocre.
The two of you, I appreciate that almost more than anything else you've said about my book. My puns are not terrible. I am the son of my late father was rejoiced in terrible puns. The more terrible the pun, the better. So to know that they're not that terrible is great. Thank you.
Well, listen, this has been a great hour, and I hope we can get you again. Also, would love to have you come out to the States and do a book tour. And I know John and I would bend over backwards trying to get you booked out, at least on the West Coast where we have some connections. But this book is something that, honestly, anybody in the military should be reading if you're going to understand anything in the Mideast or Orient, to understand what you've put down. It's compulsory if you want to be relevant in the modern fight that we have in that part of the world. If you're not talking intelligently about the Mackintosh-Smith master work, then I want to struggle to take you seriously. It's like not being familiar with the Quran and going there, and it doesn't make any damn sense. So make sure, if you guys get this book on Amazon, make sure you rate and review it, because that gets the book advanced up. You can see Tim's work for years on this thing, and we all deserve to give him a little bit of credit, a little bit of money out of our pockets. Gosh, I'm telling you right now, whatever the book cost you, you're going to get way more than that back. Tim, thank you so much for coming on. Will you come back and talk with John and I again?
Thank you very, very much. I can't thank you both enough. You've both said the kindest possible things, and I greatly appreciate them. And yeah, I would love to talk again. I don't know what about. I'll have to write another big book.
Not needed.
We might find something else to talk about. Perhaps I'll start writing poetry. I'll write a haiku.
Haiku, there you go. You can.
Haiku.
Another thing that I'm saying deeply from the heart, I really hope I get to meet you, and the sooner the better. You're a fascinating gentleman.
So are both of you, and I can hear the bell. It sounds as if we've, been having a boxing match. That's the end of the round.
With those bells, I guess we'll call that an episode. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, John. Thank you both very much.